Welcome to another episode of Things That Matter. My name is Josh Turansky. This is Pastor Brian Broderson of Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa. It's great to be with you. Thanks for tuning in, checking out these videos. You can watch them on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and wherever you are watching them at. We'd love to hear your feedback. You can comment in some way or another depending on what platform you're watching this. Today we want to talk about race relations in America. We happen to be recording this just one day after 5 police officers were shot in Dallas. This whole week has been a difficult week when it comes to race relations. Earlier this week, a black man named Alton was shot by police officers as he was already restrained. Another gentleman who's black, Phildo, he was shot in his car. And it's just been a really upsetting week, Pastor Brian, as we've considered these things. We watched them from afar. It's in social media. We're in crisis, and this isn't new. I mean, we've been in crisis for a couple of years on this issue.
Yeah, we really have. And I, recently with our pastors' conference that we had recently, one of the things that we did, kind of a panel discussion on, was the race issue. Yeah. And I think the church, is uniquely suited to address this, and of course the church needs to rise to the occasion. And I know that I know many are, but I think we just have to ask ourselves the question, are we doing all that we can do to kind of diffuse this kind of a situation, and are we doing all that we can do to help in these places where you just have this kind of activity happening? Way too frequently. Interestingly, just yesterday, I had about an hour-long FaceTime conversation with our friend Travis Tyler, aka Thistle, and we were talking about how we can partner together to impact. Thistle's from St. Louis. He was right there through the whole Ferguson ordeal. And one of the things that we talked about when he was out for the panel, I asked him, because he had expressed this, he felt like the church really dropped the ball during the Ferguson ordeal. And, I asked him, how could the church have done a better job? So that's a question that I'm asking as a white person, as a pastor, as someone who believes in the power of the gospel. I'm asking the question, how can we congregationally, how can we as a network of churches, because of course we belong to a larger body of churches, how can we be more intentional and more impactful in helping in these communities? And of course, you've got all of the political perspectives on what needs to be done, or what should have been done and shouldn't have been done, and all of that. And you've got the long history of the mistreatment of black people in this country. That is an undeniable fact. Anybody who sticks their head in the sand on that is really, I think, making a huge mistake. But again, we can't go back and change history. So how can we move forward? And anyway, back to my conversation with Thistle, we were talking about all kinds of things, from helping guys who want to come out of the gang world, and they need relocation because they can't come out of their gang and survive in the same location. They'll get killed. Yeah. And how can we take people from that violent background and of course see them come to Christ, but then how can we give them tools to kind of go on and live a productive life? So we were just brainstorming. This was yesterday. So this was before the whole thing went down in Dallas. But it was on the heels of the conversation, that we had recently at our pastors' conference. So this is something that's been on my heart for a long time. When I was pastoring in London, our church consisted of, it was probably at least 50% people with African descent. Of course, you don't have African Americans in England. You have Afro-Caribbeans, or you have people who are literally from, Kenya or Uganda or whatever other African country you might consider. But we had a beautiful multi-ethnic congregation. And I remember people would ask me, like, how did you do this? How did you accomplish having this multi-racial, multi-ethnic congregation? And, we didn't really set out to do it intentionally. It wasn't like we had some agenda, like we're going to go in and we're going to reach, this group of people. We just went in with the gospel and with the love of Jesus, and whoever walked through the door, we don't care what color they are. We're just welcoming everybody just like the Lord does, because this whole color thing is just it's so tragic, and it's so, really, it's so foolish. We're all one family. We're all human beings. We're all made in the image of God. So anyway, this stuff is stuff that's kind of been burning on my heart for quite some time.
It's bigger than just these cell phone videos, and that's kind of like a manifestation of a bigger problem. And so if you're a black male, especially if you're a black male, you're facing a lot of cultural issues. So, it's difficult, though, to kind of being a white male growing up conservative politically. You're not exposed to those issues. And even some of the knee-jerk reactions with some of these shootings was like, well, I'm sure there was a context. I'm sure he was really doing something bad anyway. And the more we look at it, and the more I think I've looked at it and been empathetic and realized, wow, there are some really huge challenges that black men, the black community face in America.
And I think for white people like us to ignore that or to deny that, I think that only exacerbates the problem, because we just don't know. I mean, we've had one context that we grew up in. They have a completely different context, and so I think it's a huge mistake, for anybody like us to be pontificating about, well, they shouldn't have done this, and if they only would have done that. I recently read, Thistle wrote a biography, an autobiography, as well as Lecrae has written a biography as well. And in reading both of their stories, they're different stories, but they're very similar. And when you read about the environment that these guys grew up in, I mean, it is unbelievably dysfunctional in every sense of the word. And so you look at that and you think, wow, this is where there's been a massive failure in a number of ways, obviously, with our government and the policies and so forth, with the black community. So I think the first thing that we need to do is we need to be empathetic, rather than dismiss it as, well, if they, I mean, you've heard people say they need to get over it. We have a black president. They need to get over it. There's lots of there's successful black people, and the ones that aren't are just, they just need to get over it. I think that is an entirely unacceptable, approach to things. So.
Let's talk about it from a theological perspective a bit, because the church, there are many people who have gotten to the point where they care culturally and say this is a problem, and so you have a lot of suggestions that are out there, but the church is positioned with a kind of underlying theology that is really, that's core to the answer to these issues. What is that?
And let me say this, that is all absolutely true, but one of the greatest misfortunes in our history, the history of the church, and particularly the history of the church in this country, is that Christians bought into racism and perpetuated it, and especially in the American South. And so that's a huge... that was a massive mistake on our part, because if the gospel tells you anything, it tells you, in the words of Thomas Jefferson, that all men are created equal. That's the point of the gospel, and created equal because we're all made in the image of God. But then when you come to Christ, there is even, in a sense, a greater equality that should exist there, because there is no Jew nor Greek, there is no bond or free, there is no male or female. But sadly, the church, unfortunately, ignored the Bible and just went along with the culture. And now Black Lives Matter, for example, is where the civil rights movement was rooted in the church. Black Lives Matter has no connection to the church, and is actually in some ways probably somewhat hostile to the church because of that past. So we can't keep making the same mistake. And I really appreciate guys like Russell Moore, who are, Russell comes from the South, so he knows it in an entirely different context than we would. But to stand up and say, look, we have got to get this right.
Yeah.
And we do have to get it right, because the gospel is the answer. And the gospel's holistic. The gospel is not just say this prayer and Jesus is going to save you, then, we'll see you later, hope you do well. We've got to go in, we've got to plant churches, but those churches have to be conscious of the needs in the community. Talking to Thistle again, we're talking about, how can we help educate people? How can we give them basic life skills? How can we teach them a trade? Things like that. Those are things that missionaries have done forever. And when we talk about missional, it's being a missionary in your own country. Yeah. And we've got plenty of work to do. The thing that I think is very significant, and again, we need to listen to our black friends, our black brothers, is that even many of the evangelical guys are pretty much saying the same thing. Their voice is right there with the black community, that, look, this is a real problem, and listen to us. And don't tell us that we shouldn't feel that way. Help us, move out of the situation that we've been in. I read a couple of articles recently at the Gospel Coalition, and I just thought it would be good to read over them real quickly, because both of these articles were written by black evangelical leaders. And Micah Edmondson, he wrote this first one. He said, "My wife has to beg me, a grown 37-year-old man, not to go out to Walmart at night, not because she's afraid of the criminal element, but because she's afraid of the police element. Because she knows that when the police see me, they aren't going to see Micah Edmondson, pastor of New City Fellowship Presbyterian Church. When they see me, they aren't going to see Micah Edmondson, PhD in systematic theology. When they see me, all they're going to see is a black man out late at night. And she knows we're getting stopped at 10 times the rate of everybody else, arrested at 26 times the rate of everybody else, and killed at 5 times the rate of everybody else. Black Lives Matter can see the injustice in those statistics. How can Black Lives Matter see the value of black life better than we can? Why do Black Lives Matter care more about the value of my life than evangelical believers do?" That's heavy.
It is.
And it's coming from a brother. So these are the kinds of things that I think we can't ignore this. We need to do what we can. Obviously, we need to pray, but we need to seek the Lord for a strategy. And that's, we have a number of brothers in our movement, guys who are pastoring churches, black pastors. And my heart is to connect with those guys and say, how can we work together with you? Of course, we're in the LA area, so we've got some connections there, and we've been doing stuff in those neighborhoods for a few years. But I think we just need to turn it up and do more.
Amen. We want to thank you for tuning in to Things That Matter. If you have feedback for us, again, leave us a comment on whatever platform you happen to be watching this on. Share the video with your friends, and tune in next week as we come back to you with more Things That Matter. God bless.